Imagine standing in a hushed hall, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, a flickering rush light casting long shadows across faces etched with judgment. The year is 910. You've seen something crucial, something that could change a person's fate, perhaps even save a life. You step forward ready to speak your truth, but what if the very sound of your voice, simply because you are a woman, holds less weight than a whisper in the wind? What if your vivid memory, your clear perception, your unshakable conviction means almost nothing to the powerful men who hold the scales of justice? How could something so fundamental as speaking your truth be stripped of its power simply because of your gender over 1,000 years ago? Number 6. The shadows of guardianship. In the quiet, often muddy lanes of an Anglo-Saxon settlement like Thorneby, where the year 910 had unfurled its days under the watchful eye of King Edward the Elder, life was a tapestry woven with threads of custom, common law, and the occasional harshness of the elements. The very fabric of society was deeply patriarchal, a reality that cast a long, often invisible shadow over the lives of women, particularly when it came to matters of justice. This was not a realm where individual autonomy, as understood today, was a widespread concept, and for women, their legal standing was inextricably linked to the men who stood as their guardians. Consider Elara, a woman of perhaps 30 years, her hands calloused from the demanding work of the loom and the garden. She possessed a keen eye, a sharp memory, and a quiet dignity that earned her the respect of her neighbors, even if that respect did not translate into full legal equality. One bleak winter morning, a dispute arose in Thorneby concerning a stolen pig, a truly grave matter in a community where sustenance was often precarious. The pig belonged to a family that had already suffered a poor harvest, and its disappearance threatened to push them to the brink of starvation. Elara had witnessed the theft, seen the shadowy figure slip away from the sty in the pre-dawn gloom, a large sack slung over his shoulder, and she had recognized him. It was a man from a neighboring village, a known troublemaker named Cynric. When the reeve, the local official responsible for administering justice, convened a rudimentary court in the village hall, little more than a large central dwelling, Elara presented herself, intending to provide her vital testimony. The hall was filled with the men of Thorneby, their faces stern and serious, their voices low as they discussed the implications of the theft. Elara, accompanied by her husband Bjorn, stood before them. She had rehearsed her words in her mind, clear and concise, ready to detail what she had seen. She began to speak, her voice steady, recounting the chilling sight of Cynric leading the frightened pig away. However, as she spoke, the reeve, a man named Wulfstan, held up a hand. His gaze was not unkind, but it was firm, unwavering in its adherence to the established norms. He turned to Bjorn, Elara's husband. Bjorn, Wulfstan stated, his voice carrying an air of customary authority, "Does your wife speak with your consent in this matter?" Bjorn, a sturdy man with a quiet disposition, nodded. "She does, Reeve. Her eyes are true." But the subtle pause, the direct question to her husband rather than to Elara herself, was a stark reminder of the legal landscape. Elara's testimony, though her own experience was not truly her own to offer in the same independent vein as a man's, she was, in the eyes of the law and custom, under the mund of her husband. Concept of mund was a cornerstone of Anglo-Saxon society, signifying guardianship and protection, but also control. A woman, whether unwed, married, or widowed, was generally understood to be under the legal authority of a male relative. Her father, her husband, her brother, or even her son. This guardianship was not merely a social courtesy. It had profound legal ramifications. A woman could not typically bring a case to court, initiate legal proceedings, or even offer independent testimony without the express permission and often the presence of her guardian. Her legal identity was in many ways subsumed within that of her male protector. Elara's testimony continued, but the air in the hall shifted subtly. Cynric, The accused, a surly man with suspicious eyes, watched her with a sneer. When it came time for his defense, he did not directly refute her account with details of his own whereabouts, but instead questioned the very premise of her word. Is the word of a woman, however well-meaning, truly enough? He challenged, looking directly at Wulfstan, bypassing Elara entirely. Perhaps her imagination played tricks in the dim light. Perhaps she misremembered. We all know women are delicate. Wulfstan considered this. While he did not outright dismiss Elara's account, the seed of doubt, planted by Cynric's subtle attack on her legal standing, had taken root. The weight of her testimony, however clear and unblemished by falsehood, was inherently mitigated by the requirement for her husband's consent and the underlying assumption that her word was not fully independent. It was not a matter of whether Elara was telling the truth. The community knew her to be honest, but whether her truth, originating from a woman, could stand alone without the bolster of male authority. Another witness was called, a man who had heard a noise in the distance but seen nothing distinct. His testimony, though far less precise than Elara's, was accepted without question regarding its legal validity, even if its factual content was weaker. There was no inquiry into who granted him permission to speak, no implied question about his delicacy. His words simply existed full and unburdened by the same legal strictures that bound Elara. The court debated. The reeve, bound by custom and law, had to weigh Elara's vivid account against the general legal principle that a woman's independent testimony held less weight. It was not that women were never allowed to speak. They were, but their testimony was often viewed as secondary, requiring corroboration or explicit male endorsement to gain full legal traction. Historians and legal scholars studying this period note that while women sometimes appeared in early medieval courts, their roles were often circumscribed, typically as accessories to their male kin or in specific cases pertaining to women's own bodies or property, such as dower or bride wealth disputes. But even then, often with a male in the end, Cynric was not immediately condemned based solely on Elara's word. The court required further investigation, seeking other forms of evidence, perhaps a trace of the pig or another witness, however minor, to solidify the case. Elara's clear sight had provided the crucial lead, pointed the finger directly at the culprit, yet her voice, though heard, was not given the final decisive power it might have possessed had it belonged to a man. The legal framework of mund, while intended to protect, simultaneously diminished the independent legal agency of women, forcing their truths to pass through the filter of male guardianship before they could fully impress the scales of justice. In 910 odd, the shocking reality was that even a clear eyewitness account could be undermined by the unspoken rules of who was truly allowed to speak for themselves. Number 5. The Peril of Passion. Life in the year 910. Particularly in the scattered settlements of England and other parts of early medieval Europe, was governed not just by written law, which was scarce and often localized, but by deep-seated customs and traditions that shaped every aspect of human interaction. One of the most powerful of these unwritten rules concerned the perceived nature of women. Across many cultures of this era, women were often conceptualized as beings, primarily driven by emotion, inherently less rational and more susceptible to flights of fancy or passionate outbursts than their male counterparts. This pervasive societal perception directly influenced how their testimony was received in a court of law, often diminishing its credibility, regardless of the truth it contained. Consider the tragic case that unfolded in the Anglo-Saxon village of Cynric, a cluster of timber and thatch dwellings nestled by a meandering river. Here lived Brynhild, a woman renowned for her keen intellect and sharp wit, but also for her deeply felt emotions. Her husband, Eadwig, a respected craftsman, had been found dead by the riverbank, his head brutally struck. Community was gripped by fear and sorrow, and the reeve, a stern man named Osbert, immediately sought witnesses. Brynhild, consumed by grief, but also driven by an unwavering need for justice, stepped forward. She recounted a heated argument she had overheard days before Eadwig's death. It was between her husband and a notoriously belligerent man named Wulfstan, known for his temper and his envy of Eadwig's skill. Brynhild described the venomous words exchanged, the threats Wulfstan had uttered, the barely contained fury in his voice. She painted a vivid picture of Wulfstan's aggression, detailing how he had shaken his fist at Eadwig, swearing to make him regret his insolence. As Brynhild spoke before the assembled men in the village hall, her voice trembled slightly, not from fabrication but from the raw pain of her loss. Her hands clutched together, occasionally clenched, and her eyes, though resolute, were undeniably clouded with sorrow. These natural expressions of grief, however, were interpreted through the prevailing societal lens. Wulfstan, the accused, a man of imposing stature, listened with a sardonic grin. When Brynhild finished, he immediately seized upon her emotional state. Reeve Osbert, Wulfstan boomed, his voice resonating with feigned concern. "We see before us a woman consumed by grief. Her heart is surely broken, and we all mourn with her. But can we truly trust the words of one so distraught? Is it not possible that her sorrow, her anger, has twisted her memory, caused her to imagine things that were not truly said or done?" Some of the assembled men nodded subtly. Mother. The pervasive belief was that a woman's emotional nature made her inherently unreliable as a witness, particularly in high-stakes situations. It was not that women were thought to be malicious liars, but rather that their testimony was viewed as prone to distortion by their feelings, fear, love, anger, or in Brynhild's case, profound grief. This was often tied to ancient philosophical and medical ideas, propagated through scholarly and popular discourse, that women were physically and temperamentally colder and wetter than men, leading to a perceived imbalance of humors that made them more unstable, more given to emotion, and therefore less capable of purely rational thought. These ideas, though rooted in pre-Christian antiquity, persisted through the early medieval period and deeply influenced societal attitudes. Historians studying the early medieval period note that while legal codes might not explicitly state women are emotional and therefore unreliable, the practice of law and the reception of testimony were heavily influenced by these underlying cultural assumptions. A man's testimony was presumed to be rational and objective, unless proven otherwise. A woman's, by contrast, was often presumed to be tinged with emotion and therefore potentially subjective, requiring greater scrutiny or corroboration. Reeve Osbert, a man steeped in these traditions, found himself in a difficult position. Brynhild's account was compelling, filled with specific details that spoke of truth. Yet the palpable grief emanating from her tears that occasionally threatened to spill, her trembling hands, these were not seen as signs of her profound anguish, but as indicators of her inherent feminine weakness, signs that her reason might be clouded. Brynhild, Osbert said, his voice softer, almost paternal. "We understand your distress. Your love for Eadwig was clear to all, but we must have clear, unclouded testimony to find justice. Are you certain your mind is settled enough to recall these events without the heat of your sorrow affecting your words?" This question, posed not as a genuine inquiry into her mental state, but as an implied challenge to her credibility based on her gender, wounded Brynhild more deeply than any direct accusation of falsehood. She knew her mind was clear, her memory sharp, precisely because the event had been so traumatic. Her emotional response was a direct consequence of the truth she witnessed, not a distortion of it. Yet, in the eyes of the law, her emotion was a liability. The trial continued, but Wulfstan's defense gained ground. He did not deny the argument outright, but rather characterized it as a common disagreement, magnified and misremembered by Brynhild's grief. Presented men who had seen him elsewhere at the time of the murder, offering vague alibis. Their male testimony, however imprecise, was accepted with far less scrutiny regarding their emotional state, for it was generally assumed that men, being rational, were less prone to such distortions. In the end, Wulfstan was not convicted. The evidence against him, reliant largely on Brynhild's powerful but emotionally charged testimony, was deemed insufficient. Her accurate and crucial account was undermined not by any factual flaw, but by the prevailing belief that women, by their very nature, were too emotional to be truly objective or reliable in the rigorous demands of a court of law. Her truth, though undeniable to her, was seen through a veil of perceived feminine fragility, ultimately denying justice in the year 910. Chilling reality was that an innocent tear could be more damning to a woman's credibility than a man's outright lie. Number 4. The closed doors of the public realm. In the daily rhythms of Anglo-Saxon England in 910, the division of labor and societal roles was sharply defined, particularly between men and women. Men typically dominated the public sphere. The fields, the markets, the assemblies, the battles, and crucially, the courts. Women, while indispensable to the household economy and often possessing significant influence within their domestic units, were largely confined to the private sphere, the home, the hearth, the family. This stark separation had profound implications for how a woman's testimony was valued, or rather undervalued, when it touched upon events occurring in the male-dominated public domain. Consider the thriving coastal settlement of Portwich, a place bustling with the comings and goings of traders and fishermen. Here, a significant dispute arose over the ownership of a particular fishing weir, a crucial piece of infrastructure that provided sustenance for many families. Two prominent landholders, Eldred and Thurston, both powerful men with numerous retainers, claimed the weir. The matter was brought before the local moot, the public assembly, where legal disputes were heard and judgments made. Among the onlookers, listening intently to the arguments, was Leofgifu, a wise and observant elderly woman who lived in a small dwelling near the disputed weir. She had spent her entire life in Portwich, her days marked by the ebb and flow of the tide, her nights by the familiar sounds of the village. Leofgifu had witnessed the construction of the weir many decades ago, and she knew with absolute certainty which family had truly built it and had held undisputed claim for generations before the current dispute arose. Her memory was a living archive of Portwich's history, and she was eager to share her knowledge to ensure justice. When Leofgifu approached the reeve, a grave-faced man named Osgar, to offer her testimony, he listened patiently, but a subtle skepticism played across his features. Leofgifu began to recount the story of the weir's construction, detailing how Eldred's grandfather had overseen its placement, how his family had maintained it through the years, and how Thurston's family had only recently and unjustly laid claim. Her narrative was rich with detail, naming specific individuals, describing the weather, even the tools used. However, as Leofgifu spoke of events that transpired in the public eye, the gathering of men for the weir's construction, the public declaration of its ownership by Eldred's ancestors, the disputes settled long ago at previous moots, her words met an invisible barrier. The very nature of these events, perceived as belonging to the realm of men, the world of public affairs and official pronouncements, somehow rendered her female perspective less valid. One of Thurston's supporters, a gruff man named Brand, interrupted. Perhaps her recollection is colored by gossip, or by tales told by women who themselves did not truly participate in such matters. This was not an accusation of dishonesty, but a profound dismissal of her capacity to understand or accurately recount events from the public sphere. Prevailing societal belief in 910 was that women, being generally excluded from public life, could not possess the necessary understanding, experience, or judgment to provide credible testimony on matters of public record or men's affairs. Legal proceedings, land disputes, and public agreements were considered the domain of men who were presumed to be better equipped to grasp the complexities of such dealings. A woman, by virtue of her largely domestic existence, was implicitly deemed to lack the proper context or insight to accurately interpret or recall events outside the home. Scholars studying early medieval societies often point to the functional separation of gender roles as a key factor in the undervaluing of women's testimony. While women undoubtedly contributed significantly to the economic and social fabric of their communities, their contributions were largely confined to the domestic sphere. This lack of direct participation in formal public decision-making bodies like the moot meant that their voices were less accustomed to being heard in such settings, and their observations less readily accepted as authoritative on matters that fell outside the presumed boundaries of their daily lives. Reeve Osgar, though perhaps personally respecting Leofgifu, was bound by these societal norms. He asked her, "Leofgifu, did you yourself participate in the gathering of the stones for the weir? Did you stand alongside the men when the boundaries were formally declared?" She had watched from a respectful distance, busy with her household duties, but she had seen and heard everything clearly. "My eyes were open, Reeve," she replied, "and my ears heard the words spoken, though my hands did not lay the stones." Her honest answer, meant to convey her direct observation, inadvertently reinforced the very stereotype that undermined her. She was a woman who had observed from afar, not a man who had participated directly. Her testimony, though factually precise, was therefore treated as secondary, akin to hearsay, or as an observation from a less informed vantage point. Court would prauterize the testimony of men, even if their recollections were less clear or came from a less direct source, simply because they were considered to be legitimate actors within the public sphere. The dispute over the weir was eventually settled, not solely on Leofgifu's invaluable historical account, but through the production of charters, written documents typically possessed and presented by men, and the testimonies of other men, even if their knowledge was less comprehensive. Leofgifu's knowledge, a repository of the community's shared past, was relegated to the status of interesting background information rather than decisive legal proof. Her vivid memory of events, which would have been pivotal if voiced by a man, was diminished by the prevailing notion that a woman's confinement to the private sphere rendered her incapable of truly understanding, let alone credibly testifying, on the complicate public realm in 910. The chilling reality was that an observant woman, a walking archive of history, was deemed less credible than a man with a distant memory. Number 3, the unwritten words. In the early medieval period, specifically around 910 AD, literacy was a rare and valuable skill, largely confined to the clergy, some members of the nobility. For the vast majority of the population, whether male or female, life was lived without the ability to read or write. However, the gendered access to what little education was available created another subtle but powerful mechanism by which women's testimony could be undervalued in the eyes of the law. While male illiteracy was common, female illiteracy was almost universal, and this practical reality could be exploited to question a woman's intellectual capacity and, by extension, the reliability of her testimony. Imagine the bustling market town of Grantchester, a hub of commerce and occasional disputes. Here, a merchant, a man named Aethelred, accused a local farmer, Ordric, of fraudulent dealings involving a transaction for a substantial quantity of grain. The dispute was complex, involving implied agreements, unwritten tallies, and the nuanced understanding of market values. Among those who had witnessed the transaction, and indeed understood its intricacies, was Godgifu Ordric's wife. Godgifu was a shrewd businesswoman in her own right, responsible for much of the family's economic dealings, and she possessed a keen grasp of numbers and fair prices, even though she could neither read nor write. She had been present at the market, had heard the exact words exchanged, and knew that Aethelred's accusations were a fabrication. Her testimony would be crucial for her husband's defense. When the matter came before the local Jummet, the court assembly, Godgifu stepped forward to speak. She recounted the details of the transaction with remarkable clarity, explaining how Aethelred had initially agreed to a certain measure and price for the grain, only to later claim a different, more advantageous deal for himself. Her memory was precise. Her understanding of the market values undeniable. However, Aethelred, a cunning man who prided himself on his ability to read and write a few basic Latin phrases for his ledgers, seized upon Godjifu's illiteracy. How can one understand the intricacies of a market transaction if they cannot even decipher a simple written account of it? He then produced a small rolled parchment with some written notations, holding it up as if it were an undeniable symbol of truth. For many in the room, particularly the Reeve, who was himself likely to be at least functionally literate for his duties, the ability to read and write was associated with intelligence, precision, and an ordered mind. Conversely, illiteracy, while common, could be subtly linked to a lack of intellectual rigor or a less capable grasp of complex information. It was not a direct accusation of lying, but a questioning of her capacity to accurately process and convey information, especially information relating to commerce and legal agreements that were increasingly being recorded in written form. Historians who have studied early medieval legal practices point out that while formal education was not a prerequisite for testimony, the perceived intellectual gap between the literate elite and the illiterate masses could subtly influence judgments. A woman who couldn't read a charter or sign her name might be seen as less capable of understanding the nuances of a complex agreement or of accurately recalling the precise wording of an unwritten contract. This perception was exacerbated for women because, while some men might gain basic literacy through monastic schools or apprenticeship, opportunities for women, particularly outside of noble or monastic circles, were exceedingly rare. For most women, the world of letters was entirely closed. Godjifu, he questioned, his voice laced with the implicit weight of his own literacy. You say you recall the exact measure, but if I were to show you a tally stick or a simple written account, would you be able to verify its accuracy? Godjifu truthfully answered, No, Reeve. My eyes are for the loom, not for the scholar's marks. But my memory is sharp, and my ears heard the words spoken with clarity. Her honesty, rather than strengthening her case, played into Aethelred's hands. Her inability to engage with written forms of evidence, to verify something against a written standard, even if that standard was Aethelred's own potentially fraudulent document, was used to cast doubt on her overall intellectual capacity. The implication was that if she couldn't understand the written word, perhaps her understanding of the spoken word, especially in a complex commercial context, was also flawed or symplectic. In contrast, when Aethelred presented his own records, however dubious their contents, the very act of him producing a written document, even if its meaning was contested, lent an air of authority and precision to his claims. Court would then be left to decide between a spoken testimony offered by an illiterate woman and a written document offered by a literate man. Even if the latter was potentially manipulated, the scales were subtly, almost imperceptibly tilted. Ordric was not condemned, largely because other witnesses, primarily men, also offered supporting testimony, some of whom were also illiterate, but whose intellectual capacity was not similarly questioned solely on that basis. However, Godjifu's crucial eyewitness account, her sharp understanding of the trade, did not carry the full weight it deserved. Her illiteracy, a pervasive reality for most women in 910 AD, was weaponized to subtly undermine her perceived intelligence and the accuracy of her testimony, demonstrating how a fundamental lack of access to education could translate into a devaluing of a woman's truth in the early medieval court. The chilling reality was that a sharp mind, unburdened by the inability to read, was still seen as less credible than a man's potentially deceptive written scrawl. Number 2. The echoes of ancient texts. In the year 910, the Christian faith was a dominant force, deeply interwoven into the fabric of society, law, and daily life across much of Europe, including Anglo-Saxon England. Religious doctrine, conveyed through sermons, theological writings, and the interpretations of learned clerics, profoundly shaped perceptions of gender roles and capabilities. Certain biblical narratives and their subsequent theological interpretations, particularly those concerning Eve and the fall, were frequently used to underpin societal views of women as inherently weaker, more susceptible to temptation, and less reliable in judgment than men. These pervasive religious ideas often subtly but powerfully influenced how a woman's testimony was received in a court of law. Imagine a somber scene in the monastic community of Leofric's Abbey, where the abbot, a respected but rigid man named Brother Cuthbert, presided over a local dispute. Case involved an accusation of heresy against a young lay brother Canute, who was accused of questioning certain tenets of the faith, a grave charge that could lead to severe punishment. Among the community was Sister Huita, a nun known for her piety and keen observation. She had overheard parts of Canute's conversations, and while he did indeed express doubts, she believed his words were misunderstood, taken out of context by an overzealous accuser, Brother Dunstan, who held a personal grudge against Canute. Sister Huita possessed crucial details that could temper the accusation, perhaps even absolve Canute of the full severity of the charge. She knew Canute was struggling with theological concepts, not outright rejecting them, and her testimony could explain the nuances of his speech. When Sister Huita presented herself before Abbot Cuthbert to offer her account, she spoke with calm conviction, detailing Canute's struggles, his genuine efforts to understand, and the subtle ways Brother Dunstan had twisted his words. Her account was clear, precise, and devoid of malice, aiming only for truth and fairness. However, Brother Dunstan, the accuser, a man whose ambition was as keen as his piety, immediately invoked the language of Scripture to discredit Sister Huita. Furthermore, let us not forget the ancient transgression in the garden, where the first woman being deceived fell into transgression. Is it not so, my lord, that the very nature of woman, as revealed in Scripture, is prone to deception, or at least to a lack of sound judgment, when left to her own devices? While Brother Dunstan did not explicitly accuse Sister Huita of lying, his appeal to biblical authority framed her testimony within a narrative of inherent feminine fallibility. He linked her perceived female nature to a historical and theological precedent for error and susceptibility, particularly in matters of intellectual or spiritual judgment, which a heresy trial certainly was. This kind of argument, drawing from canonical texts and widely accepted interpretations, was incredibly powerful and difficult to refute in a society where religious doctrine provided the very foundation for moral and legal order. Historians who examine the influence of Christian theology on early medieval legal systems note that interpretations of passages from Paul's epistles, as well as the story of Eve's temptation, were commonly used to justify women's subordinate roles in both the church and society. While women were revered for their piety and spiritual devotion, their intellectual and legal capacities were often seen as lesser. Their counsel might be sought in private, but their public testimony, especially if it challenged a male authority or a widely held view, could be dismissed as stemming from a nature that was inherently flawed or easily misled. Abbot Cuthbert, steeped in these very theological teachings, listened to Brother Dunstan's words with a nod of recognition. He then turned to Sister Huita. Perhaps your compassionate heart, rather than your sound judgment, colors your defense of Brother Canute. This question, posed as a gentle inquiry into her character, was in fact a profound dismissal of her intellectual and perceptive abilities, rooted directly in the religious doctrine of the time. It suggested that her piety, though commendable, somehow made her less reliable in discerning objective truth, particularly when it conflicted with the narrative put forth by a male authority figure. Her testimony, though based on direct observation, was framed as a subjective expression of feminine compassion, rather than an objective statement of fact. Court continued. But Sister Huita's testimony was largely sidelined. Brother Dunstan presented other male witnesses, whose observations were far less detailed, but whose words were given precedence, unburdened by the theological shadow cast over Sister Huita. The final judgment against Canute was harsh, though not the most severe possible. Sister Huita's efforts to clarify his words, to offer a more nuanced perspective, were not given the weight that might have saved him from punishment. Her clear observations, grounded in truth, were ultimately diluted and diminished by the powerful, pervasive echoes of ancient religious texts. In 910, the chilling reality was that even a nun's holy truth could be deemed unreliable because of biblical interpretations, suggesting her very nature was susceptible to error. The whisper of Eve's fall could still silence a woman's testimony in the hall of justice. Number 1. The imbalance of the oath. In the legal systems of 910 AD, particularly within Anglo-Saxon England and other Germanic legal traditions, oaths were the bedrock of justice. Taking an oath, swearing before God or sacred relics, was not merely a formality. It was a profound act of truth-telling, believed to invoke divine judgment upon the perjurer. The weight of an oath was immense, and the credibility of a witness was often directly tied to their ability to take such an oath or the value assigned to their sworn word. For women, however, the playing field of oaths was far from level, often leading to their testimony being fundamentally undervalued compared to that of men. Consider the case of the missing cattle in the sparsely populated region of Woolsmere. A farmer, Aethelfrith, accused his neighbor, a rough man named Cynric, of stealing his prized oxen, a devastating loss for any family. The accusation was brought before the Hundred Court, a local assembly of freemen presided over by the reeve and senior landholders. Among those who believed they knew the truth was Elara, Aethelfrith's sister-in-law, a diligent woman who lived nearby. She had, by chance, seen Cynric moving cattle, not his own, under the cover of night, guiding them toward a distant market path. She was certain they were Aethelfrith's oxen. Her testimony was direct eyewitness evidence, potentially condemning. When Elara stepped forward, she was prepared to swear an oath. She stood before the assembly, hands clasped, ready to invoke God's judgment. But before she could speak, Cyniward's advocate, a shrewd man, interrupted. "My Lord Reeve," he began, "we are here to seek truth, and truth, as we know, is confirmed by the solemn oath. But let us be clear on the weight of such oaths. It is well established that a man's oath, particularly a free man of good standing, carries its full, unblemished weight. But what of the oath of a woman? Is it not so that two women's oaths are often considered equal to one man's, or that a woman cannot stand as a sole oath-taker in certain grave matters?" This was not an obscure point of law, but a reflection of common legal practice in many early medieval societies. While women were not entirely barred from taking oaths, the value assigned to their sworn testimony was frequently diminished. In some legal traditions, it might take the sworn testimony of 2, 3, or even more women to equal the legal weight of a single male oath-taker. In other cases, women might be prohibited from swearing certain kinds of oaths altogether, particularly in matters involving serious crimes or accusations against men, where a man's word, backed by his status as a free arms-bearing individual, was deemed paramount. This disparity stemmed from a complex interplay of factors: the idea of female legal subservience, societal perceptions of women's emotionality and physical weakness, making them less reliable in the face of divine retribution for perjury, and the simple fact that men were the primary legal actors in the public sphere. Historians studying Anglo-Saxon law, for instance, often point to the different compositions of oath helpers or compurgators required for men and women. In a system of compurgation, an accused or an accuser would bring a certain number of individuals to swear an oath to the truthfulness of their claim. The number and social standing of these oath helpers were crucial, and frequently, a woman needed more oath helpers than a man for her word to be deemed equally credible, or she might be unable to bring certain kinds of charges without male kin swearing on her behalf. The Reeve, a man named Hrothgar, listened to Cynric advocate with a furrowed brow. He knew the customs. He turned to Elara. "Elara," he said, his voice hesitant, "your willingness to swear an oath is commendable, but for such a grave accusation as theft of oxen which bears a heavy penalty, your solitary oath as a woman may not carry the conclusive weight required by our traditions." Elara's face fell. She was not a perjurer, and she knew the truth. Yet, the legal system implicitly suggested that her truth, sworn by her alone, was somehow less potent than a man's. The implication was clear. Her single, undeniable oath, if offered as a man's, would likely be enough to sway the court, but as a woman's it was insufficient. It meant she would likely need a female kinswoman or neighbor to swear alongside her to bolster her testimony, effectively saying that her single voice was not enough to stand on its own in the divine eyes invoked by the oath. Cynric, sensing the shift in the court's reception, became bolder. He brought forward a single male neighbor, a man of questionable character but undisputed male status, who swore a vague oath that he had seen Cynric's own oxen in his pen that morning. This single male oath, however weak its factual content, gained disproportionate weight compared to Elara's direct, uncorroborated female testimony. Ultimately, the court struggled to reach a definitive verdict. Elara's clear eyewitness account, however true, was discounted because of the prevailing legal custom that diminished the weight of a woman's oath. Without additional female witnesses or a male to corroborate her exact citing, her sworn testimony was not enough to secure a conviction. The case remained somewhat unresolved, or at least the truth remained officially unproven in the eyes of the law, simply because the weight of Elara's singular female oath was deemed inherently less than that of a man's. In 910, and the chilling reality was that a woman's solemn promise before God, her profound commitment to truth, was quite simply not enough. It was often viewed as only half a truth needing another woman's identical sworn word to equal the credibility of a man's single voice, allowing the truly guilty to walk free and leaving the wronged without justice.